Hey everyone, have you ever looked at M365 licensing and thought, whoa, this looks crazy and looks like I need a PhD to understand this? Well, while that's true for M365 licensing in general, it also is true when you start talking about security features in M365 specifically. It becomes a headache really quickly with all the different ways that you can license features and all the confusion associated with that. So on today's episode of the podcast, Paul Schnackenburg and I, we sit down and we talk about the headache that is licensing security features in M365. So it's a great episode. Hope you enjoy. All that coming up next on today's episode of the Security Swarm podcast. Hello everyone, welcome back for another episode of the Security Swarm podcast, the podcast that brings you the knowledge and insight straight from the security lab here at Hornet Security. As always, I'm your host, Andy Surwich, and I've got a familiar face on the other side of the line here. I got Paul Schnackenburg. How's it going, Paul?
I'm good, Andy. How are you?
Doing good. Hey, anytime I start going down the M365 licensing route, you're the guy I think of. Whether that's a good thing or a bad thing, I'm not sure.
That's a terrible thing. That's a really terrible.
But when I come up with a M365 licensing question, you're my guy. And that's kind of what we're talking about today. And really, when I sat down and started thinking about like, hey, what's the title of this episode going to be? I know what I want to talk about, but what's the title going to be? And really, it's like, okay, let's have a frank discussion about licensing M365 security features. Now, you and I have had a variation of this talk before on a different podcast. For those that aren't aware, Paul and I did some podcast episodes for a show called the Sysadmin Dojo podcast, where we talk about M365 licensing in general. And if you're interested in that, it might be a little data, but I'll link it in the show notes anyway. But today we're going to focus on specifically security features in 365. So I guess, Paul, maybe where we should start is when I think about licensing in anything in the Microsoft world, I feel like I'm always comparing it with how it used to be. So when I look at 365 licensing, like how has it changed is kind of where I always start. And from where I sit in the industry, it doesn't appear that it's gotten any easier. What are your thoughts?
No, definitely not. No, it's not being simplified, that's for sure. I suppose just to give a quick context background here, just so that everybody who listens is on the same page, so that
Sure.
we know what we're talking about here. So we used to have, it still exists. There is a split between Office 365 and Microsoft 365.
Yep.
Now, Office 365 is just Exchange, SharePoint, and those sorts of things. When you go to Office 365 E5, you get some of the security features. But again, it's very Exchange and SharePoint focused, whereas with Microsoft 365, you get Azure Active Directory Premium, you get Intune for mobile device management, all of those things tie, and you get Windows Enterprise, Windows 11 Enterprise and 10 Enterprise. So that then ties into the whole security story here. So that's step number one. Now, step number two, so we're going to talk about business and enterprise a little bit later, but step number two is that so when you're talking about security features, you're really only talking about Microsoft 365. You've got to be on that side of the fence, right? Office 365 isn't going to give you enough security features to be part of this sort of overall conversation. So we're definitely on the Microsoft 365 side. And then within that, Microsoft 365, you have the F3 for frontline workers, you have the E3, and you have the E5, and then you have E5 compliance and E5 security. So as you can see now, there's plenty here to have complexity, which I think is really the point, probably, from Microsoft's point of view.
And that's an interesting point, right? Because, I mean, again, if I put my sysadmin hat back on, like, okay, I have a problem, and I'm going to go try to find a product that solves my problem, right? I don't want to have to become, I don't want to have to go get a doctorate in Microsoft licensing just to be able to figure out what the heck I need in the stack, right? So that It's interesting that you say that, and I do agree with that. Sometimes I wonder if, like, is the complexity on purpose? And I think you and I have talked about this offline before, but that is a question that comes up, isn't it?
Oh yeah, absolutely. Look, there's probably a couple of different things here. First of all, complexity in licensing in anything makes it harder to compare apples to apples. So
Right.
if you're going, should we go G Suite or whatever they call it this week? Should we go to Office 365, Microsoft 365? How do we compare them, right? And there's no, because it's so complex, there's no way you can sort of just line it up in a spreadsheet and say, oh, well, this one has 45 ticks on what we need, and this one only has 40, so we should go with this one. You just can't do that, right? Because it's just too complex. And I suppose the other reason is also some of us buy sort of list prices at the small business end of town. You don't really have any options. But if you go to Microsoft and you're a 10,000 person company or 50,000 person company, you're not going to be paying list prices, right? There's going to be an enterprise agreement and there's going to be some deals there. And because they have all these different plans, they can then sort of use that as bargaining chips in the overall negotiation on where you're going to land, depending on your overall agreement for all the Microsoft things you're buying.
Right, which kind of brings me back to the key thing I always think about, and what we just kind of started that conversation with was complexity, right? So first, out of the gates, and I'm sure we'll talk about this a little bit more as we go along, is the fact that you have Office licenses versus Microsoft 365 licenses. And here's the thing is, as a brand, to my understanding, Microsoft said the Office brand is no more. But we still see a number of those SKUs in various geographies that are still out there, right? There's a number of reasons for that, which is kind of out of the scope of this conversation. But the fact is right there out of the gate, there's two options, multiple SKUs in each option, right? And then we get into probably the next major talking point of today's episode, and that is the business denomination, I guess I would say, the business side of the licensing puzzle versus the enterprise side, right? And I know on the business side, you've got your business standard and your business premium. Can you kind of talk about how security stacks up on that side of thing? And maybe we should start with the fact that to even use business, correct me if I'm wrong here, Paul, I have to have 300 or less employees, correct?
Yeah. Now, well, strictly speaking, you could actually have 350 users and you could license 300 of them with business and another 50 with enterprise if you wanted to. You can actually mix like that. But essentially what it comes down to is Microsoft has on the small business side up to 300 users, there is no Office 365 anymore. It's only Microsoft 365. And there's one called apps, I think, business apps where you just get the Office suite.
Right.
That sort of thing. But in reality, you have two choices. You have business standard, which gives you basically no security features, but it gives you Office and email and SharePoint and Teams and all that. Or you get to business premium. Now, business premium used to be anemic when it came to security features, but Microsoft has made a big turnaround a few years ago. And business premium today, for a company up to 300 users, is very, very comprehensive in what it offers from a security point of view. It doesn't have all the security features that we'll get to a little bit later on in the enterprise suite, but overall, for a business, it's a great solution. Now, I will make one comment here. A lot of small businesses have their IT managed by a managed service provider. Now, that managed service provider will have a package that they sell. This is what we put on all our endpoints, right? So they might use a third-party endpoint detection and response tool. They might use a third-party email hygiene solution. If they're doing that, they hopefully are only selling you business standard, because otherwise you're paying for business premium, which has a lot of those security features, plus paying for the third-party products on top of it, or the extra Microsoft's extra security features on top of that. Right? And that doesn't quite make sense in my book.
Right, and I think that brings up a good point, is the fact that, a 300-person organization might have one IT person, maybe two, if they're really lucky, right? And I've seen, in my MSP days, I've seen a lot of cases where you'll have this one or two people doing everything, and they don't have the time to go learn every security feature that is baked into that suite and implement it properly. And this is something that comes up frequently when we're talking anything M365. I'm not sure I have ever seen a single organization fully utilize every feature that they were paying for, right? And that's because of, again, not just licensing complexity, but because of feature and product complexity, right? And there's a lack of knowledge there. And I think that's where a third party like us and people who listen to the show know I always use us as an example, right? But that's where we can provide some value to, people that might not have the IT resources to properly leverage the stuff that's inside of that suite.
And that's what very much ties back to what we talked about in an earlier podcast, you and I, a few weeks ago, that it is an enterprise solution that has been scaled down to fit into a small business space, right? And that means there's a lot of configuration, a lot of knowledge required, a lot of the right buttons to press and configuration to set up. Microsoft is making it a little bit easier, but it's still not the same as hey, here's a third-party product that is easier to set up. And whether you're going with the native platform protections or whether you're going with a third-party solution, that is what I find in security as well. It is very, very, very common to see people implementing a solution they think is giving them a certain level of protection, but because they didn't configure it correctly or it didn't come configured correctly out of the box, they're actually not getting the protection they are thinking they have, and that is a problem.
That's a good point. And the feature that I pick on sometimes in the 365 suite when I'm kind of having conversations like this is email encryption in 365. When it's configured properly and managed properly, it works. It does a good job, right? Yep. But the number of organizations I've seen that either did not configure it correctly or do not want to put the effort needed into managing it properly, it becomes a huge burden. And, again, using Hornet products as an example, because it's what I'm most familiar with. Surprise, wearing the Hornet shirt, right? But I look at our solution, and I mean, it's super easy to manage and utilize. So I mean, I think you said it perfectly in that this is an enterprise solution that has been squished and squeezed down to fit inside of the smaller box for these smaller organizations, right? Yep,
absolutely, and that is a challenge, and there's no way around that. You gotta protect. Otherwise, you'll get an unsolicited, unpaid penetration testing courtesy of a ransomware crew, and they will find the places where you thought you were protected, but you weren't.
That's thankfully I've never been in that situation, but I have to imagine that's just got to be the worst feeling. I thought I was protected here, but I guess I wasn't. That's anyway. All right, just kind of looking at my list here. We talked about business, so let's spend a little time in talking about the enterprise side of things. And whenever anybody's starting to look at 300 plus users, they land on E3 generally as the first hopping point, I guess I would say. And one thing that you had mentioned to me previously is that when you look at E3 and compare it with Business Premium, you're almost in a worse place for security, right? Can you kind of elaborate on that a little bit?
Sure. So it used to be, right, so as I mentioned before, it used to be the business premium didn't have a lot of the security features. Now it's actually flipped around the other way. So if you're comparing business premium to Microsoft 365 E3, you get a better endpoint and detection and response tool in the Defender for Endpoint, or the Defender for Business, they call it. That's the endpoint detection and response you get as part of Business Premium, compared to the Defender for Endpoint P1 that you get as part of E3. It's got more. I'll give you a link that we can pop into the into the show notes with all the details of the comparison. But basically, the P1 of Defender for Endpoint is nowhere near as good as the one that comes with Defender for Business. So that's one. The other one is there's a bit more in Azure Active Directory Premium you get with Business Premium, etc. So yeah, in my mind, Microsoft 365 E5 gives you all the collaborative features, SharePoint extension, all that stuff, and it gives you a basic level of protection, but it doesn't give you the actual security features that a larger business needs or a smaller business. Remember, just because you're 10 users in an office, if you're doing something very sensitive, you might want to be on Microsoft 365 E5, right? Even though you're only 10 users. It doesn't have to be just for enterprises because you want the security features.
Right, and just to confirm, I think it was just a slip up. You were talking about E3 there in that sentence just now, correct?
Yeah, well, I said
until you got later in the correct.
Until I got at the very end when I said a small business might go for advanced security features in the enterprise SKUs as well. But yes, I was talking about E3, and yes, I might have slipped up again.
No worries. I just wanted to make sure I was on the same page with you. So, and I'm keeping a kind of a running tally in my mind of like, okay, I'm going to pretend I'm a fresh, IT professional. I need to license 365 for my organization. And okay, we've got Office SKUs, M365 SKUs, Business SKUs, now Enterprise SKUs. And you also mentioned another area that we can touch on briefly is Azure Active Directory P1. I know there's a P2. So now we have add-on licenses as well. I want to, where I'm going next with this is I want to touch on the EMS suite as well briefly, but I want us to talk about E5 really quick too. You mentioned E5. Yep. E5 is kind of the have all the things license for 365, or that's what it was at one point in time, but we're going to get into that.
Yeah, now it used to be, right? So the highest licensing. So for those who wonder where the numbers are coming from, there used to actually be a Microsoft 365 or an Office 365 E4, but then it was too similar to the other plans, so it disappeared. So that's why we got an E3 and an E5, but no E4.
Right.
So Microsoft 365 E5 for a few years was sort of the kitchen sink and everything else. You had all the features in there, all the security features. And if you'd paid for that, you sort of got all the latest cool security features. What has happened over, say, the last maybe year and a half, something like that, as Microsoft continues to expand their security portfolio, they are adding add-ons literally on top of. So for instance, even if you're paying for E5, you got Defender for Endpoint P2, you got the highest level there, but there is a vulnerability management add-on that you can put on top of, right? So that's extra money there. And there is a few other areas where there's those sorts of features coming as well. So, the rumor has it, maybe we'll see an E7 eventually that has all those things baked in. And I totally agree with you the way you were describing it, right? Like you're a fresh IT person there, you're trying to figure out what to get and what licensing to do. And the thing is, when you're talking about one user, well, an extra $15 a month is not a big deal. But when you're talking about 100 users, all of a sudden it starts adding up, right?
1,000, 2,000, 10,000 users.
It quickly adds up. So that is a challenge.
Yeah, and last I knew, nobody quote me on this, but last I knew, E5, at least here in the States, I want to say was $58 US per user per month.
That sounds about right.
And then you have to, then now you're telling me like if I want some of those, other security features, now I have an add-on license on top of that.
Yeah.
It quickly becomes a tough pill to swallow, and then that comes back to my previous point about the fact that I don't think I've seen an organization that has fully leveraged every feature that they've, especially in the E5 suite. I don't think I see people using one or two features, and that's about it, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
So I want to touch on the EMS suite for a second here, and so there might be people out there relatively new to 365 that may not know what I'm talking about here. EMS stands for Enterprise, Mobility, and Security. And this was basically, I guess, another add-on when you get down to it, right? That added some security and mobility features on top of other 365 SKUs, right? So again, we're adding another option here, and I think this has started to phase out a little bit with the disappearance of the Office SKUs, right? But it's still there and available. And again, if I'm pretending to be a newbie, oh, hey, enterprise mobility and security. Yeah, I need that, right? So what are your thoughts?
All right, so let me clarify that one for you because it's quite simple.
Yep.
So you had Office 365, and then as Microsoft started quite a few years ago now, started adding security features, they said, well, you've got your Office 365 E3 or E5. Here's another suite that we'll add on top of it. So in the EMS suite is Intune, Azure Active Directory Premium, and those features. Then Microsoft said, okay, now that has become entrenched enough in the market. Now we're going to call it Microsoft 365 instead. So essentially, if you took Office 365 E3 plus EMS E3 and you put them together, you get Microsoft 365 E3. And you take Office 365 E5 plus EMS E5, and you put them together, you get Microsoft 365 E5. That's essentially what it comes down to. So the reason EMS is still around is if you're on the Office suite and for some reason you want to add the EMS features, but you don't want to go to Microsoft 365. I don't know how that would work out. But anyway, the solution today is Microsoft 365 E3 or E5.
And I got another licensing pitfall there that people can run into. So now I'm going to add a little more complexity here to the pile of licenses that are starting to land on my desk here. But there are now licenses specifically for the compliance features in E5 or the security features in E5, right? So now you've got compliance E5 licenses and security E5 licenses, right? And I mean, they're kind of self-explanatory, but not super descriptive either, right?
No. So let me clarify that one as well for our listeners. So it's actually quite simple. So the E5 suite has nearly all of the security and compliance feature that an enterprise would want, apart from those add-ons we mentioned earlier. But a lot of businesses say, hey, we have other security features that cover what we need. So we don't need the full E5, but we want the compliance features because we're going to do data loss prevention, information protection, information barriers between departments in our organization. We're going to do specific records management, whatever. So they can then buy Microsoft 365 E5 compliance that gives them the compliance features but not the security features at a cheaper price than the full E5. And vice versa, you could have an organization that say, look, we don't need any of the compliance features. We're using a third-party service for that. But we do want the security features. So we're going to buy the Microsoft 365 E5 security and not worry about any of the compliance features because we're doing that differently. So that's where it comes from. And basically, they're cheaper. Or slightly more cost-effective than the full E5.
Right, gotcha. And when I think of compliance E5, I start thinking about Compliance Manager, right, which has kind of its own form of licensing in that HIPAA in the States is always the compliance regulatory body I always think of for examples. If I'm a hospital and I want to use Compliance Manager, correct me if I'm wrong, I get some baseline controls for free, right? But then I have to go buy the HIPAA pack, I guess you would call it, right?
All right. So again, a great question. And this is one that I suspect most of our listeners probably haven't heard. When you put together the show notes, make sure to link to the webinar we ran on this not so long ago, you and I. We did talk about Compliance Manager. So let me give you an elevator pitch for the Compliance Manager so people know what we're talking about. So as part of Microsoft 365, there's something called Compliance Manager. Inside of there is about 800, number keeps changing all the time, worldwide different regulatory compliance frameworks. So obvious ones, as you mentioned, is HIPAA, GDPR in the Europe, SOC, ISO 27001,
Right.
whatever, PCI DSS, for payment card industry, all of those basic ones, plus country-specific ones that make up all those different 100 ones, right? So in Australia, there's about 4 or 5 different ones. They're all in there. So if you are an organization that need to comply with a specific regulation, if your users have E5, you get 3 free premium compliance regulations, right? So there's some basic ones built in. Everybody gets those for free, no matter what licensing level you're on in Microsoft 365. But the premium one then gives you the advanced ones. You get 3 for free. And above that, you then pay per compliance regulation you need to be compliant with. I don't know the price off the top of my head, but I think it's a few $1,000s. Now, realistically, if you're a medium to large organization that need to comply with a specific regulation in your country, the few $1,000s is going to cost you to buy that premium compliance regulation in Compliance Manager is going to be the very, very smallest part of your overall cost of becoming compliant with that regulation.
Right.
Because there'll be hundreds of controls, there'll be hundreds of man hours or people hours to figure out all the things you need to do, test it all, make sure you've covered it all, get it ready for the audit, prepare every documentation so that you can hand this over. One of the big benefits of Compliance Manager is that because it's based on the cloud service that is Microsoft 365, a lot of controls are already taken care of by Microsoft. So if you're going to be compliant with a particular regulation, one of the things they probably have in there is that you need physical access security to your data, where your physical data centers are or your servers are. Well, Microsoft's already doing that. They've got the armed guards. So you get a tick, that's already done. So you don't need to worry about that to be compliant with the regulation.
Right.
So Compliance Manager is very powerful. It's one thing that a lot of people don't even know is there. But if you need to be compliant with a regulation, it should be the one you should be looking at.
Yeah, and I think we talked about this a little bit in that webinar you mentioned. And again, I'll be sure to get that in the show notes. But one thing that I remember stands out is Compliance Manager, fantastic tool. It does a lot. You have to have the resources and the team to use it, though. Mm-hmm. Right, which kind of ties back in with a lot of the stuff that we've been talking about. Right, is I have to have the manpower and the training, and you've probably seen this working with your customers, and I've seen it back when I was doing support as well too. Usually, when a customer or an organization has to start dealing with compliance regulations, there's usually a couple of check boxes that they're focused on. Right. Mm-hmm. That maybe they have most everything else taken care of, but they're just looking to check off those last couple of ones, right? And this kind of ties in with my last bullet point for our discussion today, and that is that's kind of where a third party can come in and help, right? Maybe they don't need an all-encompassing, expansive tool like Compliance Manager, or maybe they don't have the resources to use it properly. Maybe they just need email encryption or signatures and disclaimers, or heck, maybe they just need backup and archival, right? And that's where a third party comes in. I mean, again, I always use us as an example, but I do talk with some of our customers that, we just needed some sort of legally compliant archival, and we help them check that box, right? Same thing with long-term retention of emails. Some organizations have to hold on to emails for 10 years. Problem solved. Or HIPAA, they're not supposed to be communicating via email in most cases, but there are cases where you'll have an insurance company here in the States communicating on the regular with a medical organization, and they'll use our encryption solution to set up persistent encryption between the two organizations, right? Typically using PGP or something along those lines. And so, that's kind of where we can come in and help provide value for those more specific cases, and those cases where they just need an easy solution to use. Now, the other thing I wanted to get into as part of this is when we look at security, complexity is bad for security, right? I mean, it's just kind of a general, well-known thing. Complexity is bad for security. So stepping back and looking at the scope of this episode where we're talking about licensing in 365, it's complex, right? There's nothing simple about M365 licensing. And the chances that, again, pretending to be a novice 365, fresh out of, I don't know, university maybe, coming in, setting up 365 for the first time, the chances of me getting what I need for my organization and setting out properly are probably fairly low, I would think.
Yeah,
and
absolutely.
This kind of, you and I have talked about this before too in previous pieces of content, the fact that Microsoft is providing, services in 365, and there are security holes and security vulnerabilities that need to be protected and looked at. So I'm going to have to come in and buy my productivity, my licensing just for general productivity, use of Office, right? And then also have to pay to secure it on top of that. I think I've already said this about something else in this episode. That's a tough pill to swallow, right?
It absolutely is. And I completely agree with you. I mean, there's definitely a conversation to be had here, right? You're buying the base platform from the same company that then turns around and says, hey, you need these extra security features on top. Here's the extra bill for that, right?
Yeah.
It's as if you bought a new car and it was like you're about to drive out of the lot and then they go, no. Well, you probably want to pay extra for the seatbelts and the airbags because you probably want that security. And it's like, shouldn't that be built in, right? So there's definitely a conversation to be had there. And obviously the benefit of going with a third-party product is, well, they're generally easier to configure, but also it sort of keeps Microsoft honest, right? Because you're not relying on them for everything, where they might say, well, we're going to take these 10 engineers that we're working on improving the base platform, and we're going to put them over on this new fancy security feature over here that will only be available to E5 customers, right? And that's just the reality of the size that Microsoft is and the fact that they sell the base platform and the security features.
Right, and I've talked with some auditors in the space too, and I know there's no law or regulation against this, but I've had it communicated to me a couple of times that it just is kind of like this icky gray area where you're using the same, they call it vendor overdependence, right? They're using the same vendor for productivity and then also using the same vendor for securing that same platform. And it's like the metaphor I always use, it's like, okay, the factory owner is also the factory inspector, right? And it's, maybe it was you that used this one time. The fireman is also the arsonist, right?
Yeah. That came from me. It actually came from a podcast I listened to. I can't even remember who actually said it originally, but I stole it from them and I didn't know how to attribute it because I couldn't remember who it was.
That's a good one.
That is a good one. And it definitely is something to think about there. On the other hand, you probably want to also consider that if you're going to stay on the base platform from Microsoft and then buy third-party products on top of it, you want to make sure you cover all the different vectors, right? Because email security hygiene is one thing, right? But you also want to protect your endpoints. So you're going to need a good endpoint detection and response tool that can go across all your different platforms. So you want Mac OS, you want Windows, you want Linux, you want iOS, and you want Android, right? Then you also will probably want something for your identity. So you want to have a good product in there. Modern company, you probably have people working from home and elsewhere and whatever. So you probably want a CASB solution, so a cloud application or app security broker, like a modern firewall in the cloud as a service sort of thing. You want to have that in place so you have all that monitoring. And then you want to tie all those products together. So you do need to think about the holistic approach here when you're picking your building blocks for your security solution.
Definitely. Well, Paul, I think that's probably a good place to call it good on this episode. Again, like so many of our conversations, I feel like we could go for a part 2, and maybe we will at some point, right? But Yeah, I want to thank you for spending some time with us this evening, Paul, or, well, evening for me, morning for you.
Yep.
But appreciate you spending some time and sharing your knowledge with us, my friend.
This was great. It was great. I
Yeah,
hope it was useful for the listeners.
definitely. And those of you watching, hope you found value in this episode. If you did, hopefully you'll hit that subscribe button. Again, we are available on all the major podcasting platforms, so be sure to take a look for us. The other thing is we've talked a lot about some of the security features that we do offer here at Hornet Security and how they can kind of help and tie in with securing your M365 environment. I'll include a link just generally to our kind of our features list. That way, if you're interested, you can take a look there by all means. With that, I think that's it for our episode. And have a good one. Stay safe out there, and we'll talk to you later.